For 6 years, billionaire philanthropist David Rubenstein has hosted dinners for lawmakers at the Library of Congress, each featuring a modern historian. Rubenstein has published a collection of the dialogues in The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. We spoke with him last week and asked why knowing the past is so important to understanding the present.
The theory of history is that we can learn from what we made mistakes about before and what we did right before, and then maybe we can do better things in the future. Civilization is all about improving things, and if we don't improve from the past, how are we really advancing civilization?
When members of Congress come to these gatherings, bipartisan, do you find that they ask questions with a specific intent because they want to use it in their own lives?
It's like an era of good feelings when the dinners occur. There's no bickering. Members from the opposite parties sit together, members from the opposite house sit together, and you wouldn't know how rancorous the atmosphere is in other parts of Washington, but it's like a time where they put a truce down and they come together.
Do you see anything, or have the historians been able to give these members of Congress any guidance on how they can break out of what they all agree is a time of hyper-partisanship?
I don't think the historians are trying to lecture members of Congress of what they should do. They're just saying, I wrote these books, let me tell you about these great figures, and you take the lessons away from them that you will.
Have you had a moment or a time in your career where the lessons of history have really been applicable?
Well, as a young man, when my hair was dark and I was much thinner, I worked in the White House under Jimmy Carter. I wish I had as much knowledge of history then as I do now.
He was a disruptor of the system. He had won the presidency when people didn't think he would, and they came to Washington saying, we're not going to do things the old way. Would a little lessons of history have been helpful to the Carter team when they came in?
Well, I think in hindsight, we made some mistakes, and I would take the blame for it as well as other people who were involved in the system as well. But we did some very good things. We did say we're going to shake up Washington, and Jimmy Carter came up with a very unique idea. He said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not from Washington, and that was unique at that time, and he kind of used that populist appeal. When we came to Washington, we probably didn't have as much breadth of knowledge of people who had served in Washington before. But in hindsight, President Carter was president for only 4 years, and we did an enormous number of things. And today, the amount of legislation we passed in that 4-year period of time dwarfs what's getting done today.
One of the things you've asked these historians when you've talked to them is if you could talk to one former president and ask them a question, which one would it be? So for you, what former president, if they were alive today, would you want to talk to, and what would you ask them?
In my view, in our long history in this country, the greatest American without doubt is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln held this country together because it wasn't obvious to people that the country should stay together. I'm not sure any other person who elected president would say to the South, no, we're not going to let you go away. So I would ask him 2 questions if I had a chance to have dinner with him. One, why did you feel it was so important to have the South stay as part of the country? Why not let it go away? And secondly, were you convinced that ending slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation was the only way to win the war? And are you pleased that you ultimately freed the slaves, and why did you not do it earlier?
When you look at Lincoln, he came into that job with a kind of a patchwork of experience and a lot of failures. What do you see in his background that tells us about Lincoln's success?
He probably didn't have more than a second-grade education. He taught himself how to read. He loved to read, but he really didn't have a classic college education. He didn't really go to law school. He took the people who were more likely to be president or presidential nominee in his party, and he brought them together in his cabinet. And he really took the best of their knowledge, and in the end, those people idolized him. Abraham Lincoln's great talent was that he didn't take himself too seriously. He had a great sense of humor. He knew how to write extremely well. He had a way with words that really no president has really had since that time.
Which president, when you started becoming a presidential historian yourself and so interested in them, which one was the first one that you really got turned on to the presidency about?
I think President Kennedy was somebody that took my generation and said, come in and give back to your country.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
It inspired me to go into public service, and many people in my generation were similarly inspired.
And you've dedicated your life to public service in one form or another. What do you think is the state of that notion in America, the ask not notion?
I think Americans want to make the country a better country, but I think what has changed from President Kennedy's time is that many people think you can help your country as you can without having to go into government service. There's so many NGOs today, so many ways to serve your country in nonprofit areas that do not require you to be on the government payroll. But I also think many people in our country don't feel that government service is as noble a thing as it once was, and in fact, we tend to denigrate government servants much more than we do.
Is there danger?
Than we should, I should say.
Is there danger to that?
There is. For example, it's very easy to make fun of members of Congress, and you can always get a joke by making fun of members of Congress. They're relatively modestly paid. They have an incredible lifestyle in terms of how much work they have to put in, and they're under enormous amounts of pressures, and we don't realize the burden they often face. But you can still make fun of very few people in our country. You can make fun of lawyers, you make fun of private equity people, you might be able to make fun of members of Congress, and you won't get criticized for making fun of members of Congress. But actually, they're pretty good public servants, and we should honor them more, and I think we should actually pay them more.
And we'll have more from our interview when we come back. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue with our conversation with David Rubenstein. You've had success in the public sector, private sector, philanthropy. Let's say you were thrust into the job as the president. What do you think the hardest part of the job would be?
I would want to surround myself with people who I thought had experience, who had the right motivations, were coming into public service because they wanted to help the country and not for any other purpose. I'd want to make sure I recognize that members of Congress are an equal branch of government and want to work cooperatively with them. And also want to recognize that the judiciary is also an equal branch of government, and what it says also is very important in terms of how the government is to be governed. But also, the most important thing is persuading people to do things that you think are the right things to do. And you have to persuade people by being honest with them, being forthright with them, bringing them along in a way that I think makes people feel they are getting something from the negotiation. A good negotiation is one where both sides feel they're getting something. They're not completely happy with it, but they're getting something out of it.
How do you think Donald Trump has done on that front?
Well, I think it's very difficult to judge a president this early, to be honest. I think most historians would say, give me 40 years after the presidency to evaluate whether the person's done a good or bad job.
Given what you know about the presidency, when you hear it talked about in presidential campaigns, is there a part of that conversation that you say, you know, this is nice, but it's really not what the job is?
Well, when you're running for president of the United States, your job is to get elected to some extent and do so in a reasonably honorable way. You can't say things that are ridiculous, I think, but you should do so in a reasonably honorable way. But you have to recognize that what people say in a campaign rarely can get implemented so easily. So if you say, I want to have a certain type of tax, I want to change the law this way, it's not that easy to do. You have to deal with Congress. And so I think it would be a good idea if people were to propose things that are realistically possible and not to ignore the impossibility of doing something great, but sometimes you have to have bold ideas, and bold ideas are good, but sometimes some things are just not going to happen, and you can get people excited about the prospect of it, and you're really going to disappoint people.
If you could give the American story to every presidential candidate, what lesson would you hope they'd draw from it?
I would say to all presidential candidates, learn more about American history, learn about the things we've done right and wrong in the past. Do not think you have the sole knowledge of what's the right thing to do is, and bring other people into the equation. Make sure you bring into your proposals about what you want to have done and into your administration, if you're elected, people that have a sense of history. Very often, many of our presidents have met with historians because they want to learn what previous presidents did. And I think that's a good thing. And I think learning what our previous presidents did, the good and bad, is a good way to learn how to be a good president.
Rubenstein's book was published by Simon & Schuster, a division of the CBS Corporation. The full interview is on our website, facethenation.com. We'll be back in a moment with our book panel.